Final Fantasy V is a game that was released in 1992, but the pixel remaster of Final Fantasy V was released in 2021. The almost 30 years between these two release dates is important. I never played through the entirety of Final Fantasy V until very recently in 2022. I played the PlayStation version of the game and got to an impactful moment in the story before, but never played beyond that moment. I don't remember why. I did finish the pixel remaster version of the game though, and have to say it may be my favorite iteration of the job system in any Final Fantasy game. It holds up so well, and I'd welcome a return to this system in future games, basically unchanged. It took the job system of Final Fantasy III, which in that game was a cool idea that wasn't fleshed out enough, and made it into something beautiful. You still choose a job for each of your party members, but as you level the job, you can learn skills, and those learned skills can be equipped even after you change jobs. It allows for combinations like knights who can use white magic, a little boring I guess, but you can make a lot of combos here. A dual-wielding berserker, a singing beast master who can tame wild beasts with a whip or their voice, a dancing mystic knight who can infuse their sword with spells after enthralling enemies with a wiggle and shake. I'm not saying these are all good combinations, but they are possible combinations. And considering there are 22 different jobs with multiple learned skills each, that leaves a huge amount of combinations. It was ahead of its time, and it still feels so good 30 years after the game's initial release. Apparently in some remastered versions of the game there are a few secret jobs like Gladiator and Necromancer, but they either don't exist in the pixel remaster version or I never found them. There is another wrinkle, but I'm going to first throw up a spoiler warning. I'll be spoiling a lot of the story, but also the final mechanic you learn about in the job system, which was a pleasant surprise for me that opened up even more possibilities. I'll reiterate when I get to the story section, but the following will spoil that final mechanic of the job system. Everyone starts with the freelancer job. It's unremarkable, but you won't stay a freelancer for long. Except in later parts of the game, you learn that a freelancer also keeps the highest stats from any mastered jobs, can use all the passive traits of mastered jobs, and equip any 2 abilities from learned skills. This is huge. I'd been using my top 2 characters as physical damage dealers and bottom 2 as magic. This new knowledge made me switch it up after dozens of hours of play. Doing so allowed me to enter the final boss battle with 4 freelancers who could deal heavy magic and physical damage and wear powerful armor. They were powerhouses, and it felt so good to learn all that on my own and craft characters who were ready for any situation. It's not all good. 5 resembles Final Fantasy II most in its dungeon and random encounter structure, meaning emphasis was placed on making dungeons take as long as possible by creating winding paths that make you travel through much of the screen and throwing a random encounter at you every few steps. And while the autosave and quicksave features were huge while going through dungeons, I honestly don't know if I'd have the stamina to beat the game without them, the auto battle feature becomes somewhat useless in later dungeons. Many of the game's normal enemies require specific strategies that once you get used to them aren't difficult, but still take a lot of time. This created dungeons that could really feel like a chore. There were, however, different boss strategies that were often fun to figure out. I would have appreciated them more if they didn't come at the end of a slog of a dungeon, though. For example, at one point you fight 4 crystals as a boss encounter. They each start out pretty weak, but when they get low on hit points, they'll start using hugely damaging elemental spells. So if you use a lot of attacks that hit all 4 of them, it won't be long before you'll have 4 crystals all throwing the most powerful spells at you, and you won't last long when that happens. The strategy here is to focus on one at a time to make sure powerful spells are more manageable. It's not genius by any means, but it goes against the instinct of the player and was fun to figure out. Something not quite as important mechanically about the job system is that each party member has different unique sprites for each job. This is, quite simply, amazing. 5 total characters with 22 different jobs equals 110 different sprites. I made Lenna a monk because look at those buns, adorable. And why wouldn't anyone make Krile into a white mage to see these cat airs? The job system in Final Fantasy V shares a message that anyone can be anything. Faris, a character whose gender is quite fluid, has job sprites that appear both masculine and feminine depending on the job. And I would love to say that, also like Final Fantasy II, the mechanics of Final Fantasy V gel very well with its story and characters. But unfortunately, I can't say that. which means it's time to get into the story of Final Fantasy V, which means spoilers follow. Where the mechanics and systems succeed marvelously, Final Fantasy V's story and characters are littered with troublesome issues, and I'll be discussing homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny in the story section. I've seen people say that the story of Final Fantasy V isn't supposed to be taken seriously, and I don't mean in published game reviews, I just mean from random people on the internet. And while I won't necessarily say that it's a majority of people who think this, it is at least a consequential amount of people who do. And I can't accept this point of view. It's fine and probably better if you personally decide not to take the story seriously, but there is too much here that shows the writers at Squaresoft wanted its audience to really connect with its characters and story, which means, regardless of whether or not you do, the story is supposed to be taken seriously. While I won't be going over every plot point, I think it's important to mention that there are two worlds in Final Fantasy V. We start in Bartz's world, then Galuf remembers he's from another world which we travel to. Then the two worlds are merged to create a merged world, so I guess there's technically 3 worlds. Now let's look at the characters. First, Bartz. I can honestly say I have no idea why the other people in your party decide to follow him or why they look up to him. He doesn't take anything seriously, and like Final Fantasy IV, I think the game's humor does more to hurt it than help. There's weird little euphemisms spouted by several characters, and Bartz seems to be the biggest deliverer of gems like, "Something's fishy about this place, and it ain't the smell of cod." At first, he declines Lenna and Galuf's invitation to join them on their quest, but quickly changes his mind. That's fine. One of Campbell's early steps in the hero's journey is to refuse the call to adventure. But Bartz never makes it clear why he should be the hero. In fact, he does the opposite on several occasions. Late in the game, after the main villain opens portals to the void and sucks in many villages, Bartz reacts like this. Just so we're clear, he flips out and guns the airship around the world several times. This is not a reasonable reaction. This is not the equivalent of angrily shoving everything off a desk or punching a locker. Bartz should definitely be pissed, but this reaction is putting himself and his friends in danger. And to be clear, I'm not even against him doing this. If this was presented as a flaw for Bartz to overcome, or if an actual leader took this chance to step up, I'd be all for it. But this is just dealt with like a small moment that everyone moves on from quickly. But that's not the worst thing he does. And if you've played this game, maybe you know where I'm going with this. To set this moment up, a man named Galuf had been a member of the party from the first few minutes of the game. He starts the game with amnesia, but eventually remembers that he actually lives on another world and was part of a group called the Dawn Warriors who sealed away the main villain, X-Death, which is a dumb name. After we travel back to Galuf's homeworld, we meet his daughter Krile, who is 14 years old. In a battle with X-Death, Galuf pushes himself beyond his limits. I guess you could say he breaks his limit, in an effort to save his granddaughter, and dies because of this. Krile takes his place in the party after this, and inherits all his traits. When the 4 heroes return to Bartz's original world, their other party members, Lenna and Faris, attend a lavish celebration honoring the return of Faris to Tycoon. While they're partying, Bartz and Krile leave to go find Bartz's chocobo Boko, who he has forgotten about since the beginning of the game. Krile, who is 14 years old, wonders aloud how Bartz is able to keep a chocobo in line since he has had so much trouble with her Windrake. Bartz, who is 20 years old, responds by slapping Krile, slapping her hard enough to send her falling backwards. She responds by hitting him back, but these two things are not equal. I teach sophomore English and can tell you with confidence that if I heard about a 20-year-old man who slapped one of my students, who are around 14 to 16 in age, hard enough to send her falling backwards, I would report that person to DCF immediately. One, because I'm legally required to, but also because this is actual abuse, and in Final Fantasy V it's played for laughs. It's never mentioned again how our hero forcefully slaps a 14-year-old girl, one who just lost her grandfather at that. a grandfather who basically played the role of her father. None of these actions are presented as flaws of his to overcome, just silly little story beats that are quickly forgotten. Bartz is not fit to lead, but the game never explores this. I know the Final Fantasy series was criticized after this for writing too many moody and distant protagonists, but that's honestly much more preferable to Bartz's irrationality and casual misogyny. For other characters, Galuf and his granddaughter Krile are actually pretty likable. Galuf gains his memory at pretty convenient moments, and it seems more like a way to drop important plot revelations at opportune times than an actual interesting character choice, but I do really like that you can team up with one of the original Dawn warriors who first sealed Exdeath away 30 years ago. Usually, the former heroes who first saved the world would be long dead, but in Final Fantasy V, most of them are alive, and you meet all of them except for Dorgan, Bartz's father. Dorgan died from an illness a few years ago, and Bartz never knew that he was a Dawn warrior, nor that he was originally from Galuf's world, not the world where he was born. Galuf does eventually die though, and Krile takes his place. This is the impactful moment I played to on the PlayStation version. I was surprised at how late it comes and how much of the game I'd played before giving up on it. Again, I don't remember why I stopped playing. Anyway, Krile is very sweet-natured, and the ending narration is actually told from her point of view. She's lost all her family after Galuf dies, but is able to find a surrogate family in Bartz, Lenna, and Faris. She can also commune with a lot of beasts, including Moogles, Chocobos, and Windrakes. Pets are actually very important in this game, which is an easy way to tug at my heartstrings. I need to really be invested in a character, and they need to seem believable to me for me to be upset if they die, but pets? I will always be upset when a pet dies. Faris' pet dragon Sildra, who had been pulling a pirate ship for them, dies fairly early, sacrificing herself to save our party. Lenna's pet Windrake, Hiryu, also sacrifices himself twice, to first save Lenna, then to provide the Phoenix Summon ability. Boko is Bartz's pet Chocobo, who Bartz forgets about early in the story before he needs him again after the two worlds merge. But that's okay because he's found a mate, Coco, and they have a couple Chocobo chicks together. Finally, Krile also has a Windrake who she just keeps calling the Windrake. This really bothered me. Why doesn't it have a name? She also talks to a Moogle often, but I think of the Moogle more as a friend than a pet. Back to the human characters. Lenna is probably my favorite character. She seems more like the natural leader of the group, often willing to sacrifice herself for the party or the greater good. She's the Princess of Tycoon at the beginning of the game, but her father dies, so I guess she's promoted to Queen? They never actually call her Queen, though. There's also a very touching optional cutscene at the top of Phoenix Tower that shows just how much she cares about her family. Faris, the last character, is difficult for me to talk about. For one, Faris provides Squaresoft an opportunity to get on their gender bullshit early. But in researching this video, I've also been made aware that trans people have found somewhat of a kindred spirit in Faris. So I welcome any good faith criticism of my thoughts below. I mean, I always do, but especially here. When you meet them, Faris is leading a gang of pirates and presents as male. You know something's up when Bartz and Galuf happen to see them sleeping and instantly start crushing on them. Don't worry though, Bartz and Galuf aren't gay because Faris is merely acting like a man, because after they were lost at sea as a child, they learned that pirates wouldn't accept a woman as a pirate. Phew, that was close. This means that there are several jokes about Bartz's and Galuf's sexuality that culminate in a scene where the four party members need to change out of wet clothes. Lenna goes off into another room and Bartz and Galuf stay where they are to change, but Faris refuses to change. Bartz and Galuf insist that Faris change into dry clothes and surround them, but then jump away upon realizing that Faris is a woman. This implies that Bartz and Galuf forcefully removed Faris' clothing, which is obviously a disturbing invasion of privacy no matter the gender of the people involved. In this case, it's doubly disturbing because it means they also forcibly outed Faris. When Lenna questions why Faris hides their gender, they reply, "When I was a lad, or lass, a pirate band took me in. I've been one of them ever since." Our hero, Bartz, heroically replies, "Yeah, so?" Galuf makes a statement about how he thought Faris was awfully pretty for a man. Faris ends the discussion with, "Anyways, make fun of me for being a woman and I'll shiver your timbers but good." And Bartz responds, "Whatever you say." The party goes to sleep, and when they wake up, Faris rouses them with a "Rise and shine, dullards, time's a-wasting." Then, after Galuf falls out of his bed, Faris says, "Hey, old man, that's enough lollygagging from the likes of you. On your feet, let's go." Which leads to the following lines from the rest of the party. Galuf, her tone still smacks of machismo to me. Bartz, No point in trying to change her. Faris is who she is. Lenna. That's for certain. I was a little hopeful after this exchange that this meant the party was accepting who Faris is as a person, but I think this is the last time there's any discussion of Faris's gender. We learn they are the long-lost child of King Tycoon, which means they are Lenna's sibling. The king and the chancellor both refer to Faris as Sarissa, the name they were given at birth. I've also read that in a late-game fight, Gilgamesh, an enemy you fight several times, comes to your aid and gives an emotional and inspiring speech to our heroes. In the Pixel Remaster, he says to Faris, "Try falling in love or something. You might learn a thing or two about yourself," and leaves it at that. Apparently, he used to also say, "Try acting like a woman if you still know how." Thankfully, that line was removed, but I believe that was the only other explicit mention of Faris's gender after the scene where the party discusses their gender identity in the opening hours of the game. Because the discussion about Faris's gender was relegated to a single scene early in the game, I read this to mean that Faris was a woman pretending to be a man to fit in with pirates, but otherwise identified as a woman. This belief of mine was reinforced when characters referred to Faris with she/her pronouns throughout the remainder of the game. For me, I wondered why include this scene of invading Faris's privacy. It felt to me like the only reason for Faris's presenting as male was to make jokes about Galuf and Bartz's sexuality, then drop it after the first few hours. It left a knot in my stomach for almost the entire game, afraid the characters would do something equally invasive or offensive with almost no warning. So it felt to me as I played that Faris was a woman pretending to be a man in order to lead a pirate game, not a trans man. These two things are, hopefully obviously, not the same. The idea that trans men are women pretending to be men is a harmful stereotype, but then I found an article on the First Person Scholar website, Sailing the Queer Seas, Final Fantasy V, Faris, and Gender, by Ari Hireth, who writes in this essay that they identify as a non-binary trans man, and they saw Faris as identifying similarly. They found a kindred spirit in Faris. I hope it's okay if I read a portion of that essay now. I looked for a way to contact the author, but the only thing I found was a Twitter profile, and I have removed myself from Twitter and deleted my account. I also apologize if I'm mispronouncing their name. Anyway, Hireth writes, "You also learn that Faris is Liana Tycoon's sibling, the Princess of Tycoon. After this, the game refers to Faris as her. As a child, this bothered me to no end. I didn't have the language for it at the time, but I do now. Misgendering. All I knew was that it grated me like sandpaper, and every instance of she I would replace with he in my head. I use they now because upon replaying the game, I noticed that Faris refers to themselves inconsistently between male and female pronouns and descriptors. Yet it is clear that Faris thinks of themselves as masculine, or at least proudly embodies the traits of stereotypical masculinity. Their level of courage, stubbornness, and self-confidence is often only found in male protagonists. See, for example, shonen protagonists or superheroes who tend to exemplify exaggerated masculinisms. They are also brash, rough-spoken, and a bit domineering. They are what you would expect of a pirate captain and everything you wouldn't expect of a princess. I related to that juxtaposition of gender really hard. Even Galuf recognizes Faris's masculine traits, so the interpretation of Faris as trans is certainly in the text, even if it's a little muddy. And if you found Faris to be someone you could relate to, I think that's great. Even though Hireth recognizes the character's treatment of Faris as problematic, they're still able to find comfort in their understanding of Faris's character. And I think that's beautiful. But it does make me reflect, though. I'm a white cishet man. Even within this game, I can choose two different characters who identify as I do. I don't care for Bartz as a leader, or even as a person, but Galuf is still right there, and he seems like a good guy. And I'm pretty sure that's the smallest amount of male playable characters in any Final Fantasy game, leaving out the MMOs. Faris represents one of very few trans characters in gaming, and it's pretty easy to not even read them as trans, as I did. One of the very few playable characters in the game that trans people can relate to is a character who is forcibly outed, misgendered, and dead-named throughout the game. And if you play the original, then you are also forced to listen to Gilgamesh's inspiring speech about how Faris should learn to act like a woman. Simply put, games, and we as a society, need to do better. Yeah, we can say in the 30 years since Final Fantasy V was released we are doing better, but there's still a long way to go, and in a game where it's clear that writers were willing to change the script in places, couldn't they have done a little better? And yeah, maybe I'm thinking more about this than the game's writers did, but a troublesome script isn't better just because the writers didn't think about it too much. Returning to the job system, the many detailed sprites, distinctive for each character, represent the idea that we can be anybody. Why then doesn't the story represent the same? Even if Faris is trans, why does the game's story keep pushing them into a place where they don't have the agency to identify as such? If they originally didn't intend them to be trans, which I think is probably true, why not change some pronouns in the script to reflect a character whose gender is fluid and whose friends respect that? Final Fantasy V is a game that was released in 1992, but the Pixel remaster of Final Fantasy V was released in 2021. The almost 30 years between these two release dates is important. As a society, we have a much more expanded understanding of gender issues than we had 30 years ago, and stories from that time can often reflect outdated values. Obviously, many people had extensive knowledge of societal issues around race and gender in the 90s and earlier, but I don't think those ideas were as widely shared as they are today. In 1992, companies could legitimately say they weren't aware of how certain actions towards women and LGBTQ people could be harmful. In 2022, I don't think that's possible. We can, and some certainly do, actively push back against the more expanded knowledge of human rights issues. But even people who choose to do that are at least aware, and even products of, the changing societal attitudes. And I know that so many people want to preserve the past perfectly unaltered and would push back against an updated script for a 30-year-old game, but I think the issues with Final Fantasy V's story make an excellent argument for changing the script. After all, previous versions, script intact, still exist today, so changing it for a 2021 release wouldn't erase the past. And I don't mean change major plot beats or whole scenes, just maybe have Faris' friends refer to them with they/their pronouns. They don't have to make it a big deal. Just remove the ambiguity about Faris' gender identity and have their friends fully accept them for who they are. The Chancellor and Tycoon could even still remain steadfast in his refusal to accept Faris' true identity. But shouldn't Faris' friends be more understanding? Final Fantasy V represents a step forward for the series as a video game. It's deep and strategic in ways that previous entries don't even come close to, and even challenges some later entries in terms of complexity. But as a story, it represents a too rigid adherence to a past of societal ignorance. Should they have changed the script to reflect current values? I don't know. And I don't mean that as the script of Final Fantasy V is sacred or anything. I just mean that I could see how other characters' mistreatment of Faris is something that helps some players relate to the character. The players who don't have as wide a variety of game characters to relate to as I do. That's not for me to decide. But they already changed some of the script. Is it so hard to imagine them changing a little bit more? Thank you for watching.